Yes, so my place, Tales of the Green, why archaeologists should tell stories about the past, present and future. So I am an archaeologist and a broadcaster, but really when I think about it, I'm a storyteller. I have the privileged position of telling extraordinary stories in fantastic places and learning the ins and outs of these tales by questioning brilliant people. In March 2020, whilst filming a documentary about the plague, this ability to tell other people's stories grounded to a halt. Now, I understand how ironic this might sound, that in the midst of telling a story about a past epidemic, a present-day epidemic, COVID-19, would stop me from telling stories about other people and force me to look at my own. So 2020 has been a year of extremes. On one hand, everything has been played out in the minutiae of everybody's home. Lockdown has meant that almost every human interaction we have had has focused on our immediate locality. Whilst on the other end of the spectrum, the monotony of every day has played out amongst the backdrop of tumultuous national and international events. Climate change, pandemics, Black Lives Matter, presidential elections, Cummingsgate, and that's just mentioning a few. But what did I learn as an archaeologist? I learned two things. The importance of my place, suddenly recognizing that I lived in and belonged to a community, that our stories linked into a larger national and international narrative, and the realization that archaeological storytelling doesn't have to be about the past. It can also be about the present and the future. But what did I learn as an archaeologist? I learned two things. The importance of my place. No, sorry, all archaeologists are storytellers, but they just don't know it. We are lost in our ability to tell stories, and we forget sometimes that we're an art subject as well as a science, that we've become stuck in our own jargon, that the analysis of the process of doing archaeology has almost stuck us to our own place. But I realized that working on Time Team was a huge influence on me. It showed me that I needed to deconstruct what I was actually saying, that in the shorthand that we archaeologists use for our work needs to be translated into everyday life, because our job is to tell stories, but sometimes we just don't know it. Essentially, archaeology is about asking why, how to ask a specific set of questions by collecting data to try and find the answer. The data is then analysed until it's interpreted by an individual or a small group of people, with the end product of which is a publication of the results. And that all sounds extremely sterile, but what about the stories? But the interesting thing about archaeology is that you can tell at least 100 variations of a story, whether that's by looking at the landscape, the material culture, the artifacts, the standing buildings, or the very people that lived in a particular area at a particular time. In fact, this is just a small set of examples of how many different narratives that you could investigate. There are thousands of computations you could explore. But what I found during lockdown was that these stories don't have a beginning, middle, or an end, that there are no clear definitions of past, present, and future. But in fact, what you're looking at as your place within an environment is that there is a mingling of time. But what do I mean by that? Well, that I started looking at the stories of the past, that they were often linked to the present. The only reason why I started to look further into our local archaeology during lockdown was because I was bored at home. That the present restrictions of COVID-19 made me look at my immediate surroundings, and that the stories that I uncovered from the past were recounted in the present to then be retold in the future. Whilst writing this, I realised that I had unknowingly created our own green tradition, that like other cultures of the world that retell their histories, that we were doing the same. Our oral tradition was on a Friday evening on the green. When we were permitted to meet outside in groups, my husband and I had set up a socially distanced Friday cocktail hour. It was very cathartic. We laughed, we cried, and we talked about our working week. but I also found myself updating our neighbours about what we had managed to find out about our local investigations. And in response, some of the long-standing residents could fill in some of the missing gaps for us, or at least remember the makeup of the area through their own personal experience. But I also realised this, that through the sharing of collective stories, it would then be absorbed by the people sat in our circle, and the people who didn't know these stories would then in time retell a version of their own to other people too. So, what about my place? This is my place. I'm going to tell you a few stories of the Green. This is Lammas Green. It's a Grade 2 listed estate, and it was built in 1955-7 by Donald McMurran. The estate is unique in its design. McMurran wanted to create open, livable spaces, and he bucked the post-war trend of creating large blocks of social housing. He was a bit of a traditionalist. He liked to have a bit of a nod to the past, and he wanted to create an idyllic village green with views of the North Downs, with cottages flanking three sides and low-rise blocks of flats at the top of the green, and at the top blocking it away from the main road, Sydenham Hill. He created 57 dwellings for the green, which was less than the permissible 70 for the 1950s. And he wanted to do this, he wrote, so as to establish conditions under which a community with its own continuity and life might be able to flourish. But what about today? Well, we still have 57 households. Some are still in existing social housing stock, but most of them are now predominantly private homes, with residents ranging in age from 0 to 96. And it also reflects the ethnicity and the diversity of the area too, complementing London's transient population. The green encompasses a northern portion of a larger conservation area. To the south is a place called Mount Gardens, and locally it's known as the Secret Road. It's a rectangular plot. It's characterised by an unmade road, and on three sides, there's a variety of houses ranging from Georgian white washerwood builds to country lodges to Victorian mansions. The oldest there was developed in 1833. There's also an access path now blocked by a locked gate from the green to Mount Gardens, and another connected path to another road to the south of the conservation area, a road called Mount Ash Road, which is a stunning example of Victorian bylaw housing. So I wanted to really look at what was going on before the green had even been built. So obviously, as an archaeologist, we always look at the archive. So I did a bit of a traditional map progression. So we can see here that most of the area was actually covered by Sydenham Common. It was a huge expanse of land covering 500 acres, and it was used for grazing animals, collecting wood, recreations and fairs. And as I later found out, it also supported a travelling community too. And on the map, you can see the land surrounding the common. To the left of the map, there's the Great North Wood, and then all of the land surrounding it is either paddocks or arable landing. Now, I also found a very interesting story about Sydenham Common. Apparently in 1792, there was a royal visit by King George III. He decided to conduct his grand review on Sydenham Common. Why he chose this, I have no idea. It's quite unusual since there were massive parks in central London. But he decided to show his military might with his grand review. So if you think about that time in history, it was the height of the British Empire. 10 years prior to that, America had fallen and France was in the midst of a revolution. There were also rumours that this may also happen in Britain. So he wanted to show the might of his army. And if we think about it, within 8 months of his grand review, the British army was to embark on the first series of battles against the French, which culminated in Waterloo. And the Times reported that the grand review was attended by many of the nobility came, and the carriages were stuck all the way up the hill. All the carts from nose to tail of the horses stuck all the way up this hill just to get to this grand review. So I just want to fast forward in time and show that in 1810, there was the Enclosure Act was enacted, where the common was finally broken up and sold off for plots for houses. And here we see already that we have established plots for houses and fields and farming and pastures. Well, this is the Ordnance Survey map of 1863 to 1870, and it shows that the characteristics of the area changed dramatically. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing, and we can see the onset of infrastructure like railways. But also, if we look closely at the area, you see the red square is where the green is. We all already have established house plots with large gardens, and within that red square, we can actually see 3 house plots there. So there used to be 3 houses that used to belong on the green. Now we already know about 2 of them. So the one to the left and the one in the middle, we've got plots and maps of that in the archive. And also one of our residents, Colin, who's now in his 60s, he remembers as a child climbing through one of the houses. It still hadn't been pulled down. But where did they go and what did they look like? So on a local forum, it was suggested that one of the houses had been bomb damaged during the Second World War. And looking at a series of maps, we couldn't actually find the bomb damaged house. I've basically pointed out on this, which is an RAF aerial collection. I eventually found it on a site called Layers of London, which is excellent because it's co-created by people. You can see lots of archive pictures and photos and that kind of thing, and maps that have been added to this. And eventually I found the last house. Here you can see that it was bomb damaged, that there is no longer a roof to it, and that it's just this square plot. So that's what we're looking at there on that map. It does actually show the 3 defined plots and the remains of that square structure. So I feel quite vindicated that I eventually found the last house that was on the green. But what did these houses look like? I always say you need to take your head out of the trench and have a look around. So what clues can you find of people that live there? And the answer is to look at the wider community and the landscape that they sit in. So the blue circle is the green and the rest is the surrounding environment. Now the archive photos and standing buildings on my street were great to look at. And there are many pre-green built houses on Sydenham Hill. But what we can say about this area, that it was rather exclusive and a bit fancy. Sydenham Hill is the main thoroughfare between Forest Hill and Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace was rebuilt here locally from Hyde Park in 1854, and this in turn led to the expansion of residential plots and had a massive impact on infrastructure and expansion of the area. The road respects the ridge of the hill, and it commands views of central London and the floodplain and the North Downs and beyond. And some of these Victorian mansions were developed in the 1840s as larger estates with bigger acreage attached, and then later on mansions on smaller plots were developed in the 1860s and the 1890s. So I wanted to explore what was actually on my street, and this is the same side of the street as Lammas Green. And if we go 2 doors down, we can see the standing remains. It's still fully functioning. This is Castlebar. An interesting story about Castlebar was that it was owned and commissioned to be built in 1880 by a gentleman called Walter Lazenby. So he's quite famous because he was part of the family that owned something called Harvey's Fish Sauce. And it got later changed, the name was changed to Lazenby's Fish Sauce. They later expanded also to pickles, and they made a fortune. They were eventually bought by Cross and Blackwell, and Walter Lazenby's son sat on the board of directors for Cross and Blackwell as well. And the interesting thing about this is that they're the only family that lived there. And then it was just derelict for years until it was later developed into a residential home for the elderly. So if we look at number 32, that still exists. I would say that that was, if you were looking at the green, it would be on the right-hand side, directly at its direct neighbour. And I think that that's a great indication of what the houses used to look like on the green. I say it's a bit of a joke when I say that it is a smaller house, and it is compared to the others. This, I think, is the creation of the smaller plots, and I think that's indicative of the houses and what they might have looked like for the houses that used to exist on the green that were knocked down. The last house next to number 32 is the Cedars. Now, this was built in 1898 by John Donkin for an individual called Charles Ashbody. No, I tried to find out what he used to do, but preliminary look into the archives made me wonder who he was, and I couldn't find any information unless I delved deeper. But this building was later bought by the Salvation Army in 1944 to be used as a children's home, which actually didn't come into fruition. It was continued to be used by the Salvation Army as an in-service training centre, but now it has been bought and is in private ownership. So this is all the southern part of Sydenham Hill. But the interesting thing is that on the north side, houses also respected the road. There are remnants of houses that no longer exist on the northern ridge of Sydenham Hill. It's quite something that not so long ago that these grand houses stood opposite the green, but by now they have now been fully reclaimed by nature and absorbed back into the Great North Wood. Today, the wood is run by London Wildlife Trust, who manage and maintain the woodland. And the OS maps show there were larger plots for these larger houses, respecting the ones that still exist on Sydenham Hill. Now, archaeologically, and there's lots of clues in the woods of what stood there. Now, this is one of the most visited features of the woods, and locally it's called the Castle, and it's called that by many children and many parents who go to visit the woods on a regular basis. And I would say that many of the little ones have honed their climbing skills by learning to clamber to the top. All of my children have done this, and it's still a local tradition that still continues. But what of its origin and whom did it belong to? Well, in 2008, English Heritage published a guide to the work of Pullum & Co. This is a company who created artificial garden landscapes, including grottos, temples, follies, and fountains. The company also developed cement that bore a striking resemblance to natural stone, and they patented it and called it Pullumite. Pullum published a prospectus in 1877 that listed all of the gardens that they had worked on in southeast London. 6 of the gardens were in Sydenham and 2 in Forest Hill, and the most interesting was described as Hillwood, Sydenham, where Alderman Stone commissioned 2 pieces of Pullumite, one in 1862 and another in 1866. Alderman David Henry Stone was a solicitor, but in 1875 he became the Lord Mayor of London. And in 1863 he moved to a place called Fairwood, so not Hillwood, but Fairwood on Sydenham Hill. And then even with these discrepancies in the record, it seems that Alderman Stone is most likely to be the best candidate to place a folly in his garden. We also have other evidence of the houses and the things that used to be in the woods. And one of them is Trackways. This is a path through Sydenham Woods which cuts directly through, running on an east-west alignment. But actually, it's not a large pathway created in the woods. It's actually a disused railway line. It used to be the London, Chatham and Dover Railway, which was constructed in 1865. And in the woods, we find a pedestrianised bridge. This bridge is quite something, really. It's currently under conservation. But this extinct railway bridge is the exact spot where the famous Impressionist artist Camille Pissarro stood to paint a picture of the new railway. This is Pizarro's painting. It's aptly titled Lordship Lane Station, Dulwich, and was painted in 1871. And the view is on the bridge looking towards the east of a train pulling out of Lordship Lane train station. So here is the station. Somebody on a local forum did this impressive patchwork to show the Pizarro standing on the bridge and also what is currently in the landscape. He's kind of overlaid it on Pizarro's painting. So you can see the bridge rails in the patchwork. There's now an estate there, but you can kind of see the gradient of the line and how it's reflected in his painting. The station used to sit opposite Horniman Museum, which in this painting doesn't exist because the construction for the museum started in 1889 and its doors opened in 1901. So if you look at the railings on Pizarro's painting on the right-hand side, I think it's like a fence line in the painting. That's the current main thoroughfare through the woods, and that leads to the Horniman. And the other set of railings just popping through on the left-hand side with the trees, that area is now filled with houses that respect an established pathway to and from Dulwich called Cox's Walk. But again, if we look further out and further afield, there are remnants of the railway that once took passengers to the South East London suburbs and the Great Exhibition. There's evidence of workers' huts and the rest of the railway line heading north towards Blackfriars. So if you look at the arrow to Lordship Lane Station, you can actually see the track runs along the bottom edge of the Horniman Gardens. That's now turned into a nature reserve and a green link walkway. And also in the opposite direction, towards the Great Exhibition, we see the remnants of an old train station called Upper Sydenham. So that was the next stop after Lordship Lane, before it landed into Crystal Palace. And in the woods, we also have a tunnel, which is now a bat sanctuary. We also call it the Gruffalo's Cave to our children. Our smallest is still really scared of that, and she won't go and walk past it. It's quite funny, really. So I also had a walk in the woods with a friend of mine, Rob, and he's a cameraman, and he kind of made me really think about how this landscape would have looked like in the 1800s, and the fact that the proximity of the train and the transport to these massive properties would have actually been at the bottom of their garden. And just the fact that they would have heard every 20 minutes the sound of the train whistle and the steam and the plumes of smoke coming from the bottom of your garden, even though you're living in a posh Desirez in Sydenham, was it's quite something when you think about it. There is one house that I really want to talk about, and this house would have sat directly opposite the green, and it's called Beechgrove. And this house was built in the 1860s, and it has had different residents and performed different uses throughout its lifetime. The footings of this property still exist and probably has the best preserved remains of the houses that used to stand in the woods. And over the years, my family and I have investigated the remains of Beechgrove in the woods. There are strange water tanks, metalworks, pumps. Here we have boundary walls. We still have the basement layers left and steps that would have been in the terrace gardens. So here we have one of these strange water tanks. We were wondering whether it was to do with heating or water supply. And also we have boundary walls, gate posts, and several gate posts to the driveway. We've also found many, many artifacts. And because the houses were built on a ridge and the gardens were built and terraced into the slope, naturally any artifacts are eroded out during flash storms or washed down the hill after rainfall. So we've never excavated any artifacts. We've literally just found them lying on the top. So we currently have 6 bottles of German stoneware, which was used as mineral water. We found an intact cold cream jar, and we found tons and tons of post-medieval potsherds. But what I really want to tell you is about two of its residents that lived there in the past and in the present. So in 1932, Lionel Logue moved to Beechgrove. You might have heard of him. He was King George VI's speech therapist. He was made famous by the Oscar-winning movie, The King's Speech. So you can see here, the house is quite vast. It had 25 rooms, 5 bathrooms, 5 acres, a tennis court, and a cook. Logue had a practice in Harley Street, but would often see private patients here, and it's thought that the king would visit the Logues regularly. On 9th of February 1933, the estate governors of Allen's College at Dulwich granted Logue permission to place a brass plate outside the property so that he could interview on the said premises a few patients in your practice as curer of speech defects. Myrtle, Lionel's wife, described how her own lovely house had become a calling point for Australians visiting Britain, especially during the war. She also recorded that His Majesty frequently comes to our house. He is most charming. Although whether he actually saw George VI at Beechgrove House is not clear. However, his biographer did record that Logue was listening at this home at Christmas to King George VI's broadcast in 1944. He telephoned the king to congratulate him and suggested, "My job is over, sir," to which the king replied, "Not at all. It is the preliminary work that counts, and that is why you are indispensable." But Logue did indeed continue to help the king on and off with his speeches and was present on VE Day on May the 8th, 1945, at his address from the balcony of Buckingham Palace. Now, during the war, Logue saw a downturn of patients, and he found it difficult to maintain Beechgrove due to the lack of being able to hire help. He's also unable to use a motor lawnmower, and instead he bought sheep to keep the lawn down. But then things go from bad to worse when his beloved Myrtle in 1945 dies, and then Logue eventually sells the house in 1947. He moves to a flat in Kensington opposite Harrods. Beechgrove was then occupied by Dr. Michael Denny, and then used as a home for the elderly for patients that were discharged from Camberwell Hospital in 1952 to 60, before it was demolished in 1983. But this wasn't the last resident of Beechgrove, because after its demolition, somebody else used to live there in the footings of the house and the remains of its shell. And they were used by a gentleman called Solomon. Now, the first time I heard of Solomon was from a friend called Barney. He's a camera assistant, and he used to live in Sydenham before moving to Bristol. But my husband came to visit me on a time team, and Barney and Nigel started chatting about Sydenham and Solomon. And it turns out that Solomon decided one day that he was going to live in the woods. I'm not really sure you could call him homeless, because he was more of a hermit. I think he very purposefully decided to make a home in the remains of Beechgrove and its grounds. And there's lots of accounts on local forums to describe his living arrangements. Solomon made his home in the woods very comfortable. His tools, cutlery, pots and pans were conveniently hung along the surviving old wall of Beechgrove, a wall on which on its street side had its mortar pointing between the bricks picked out by Solomon in an attractive shade of mauve paint, which contrasted nicely with the red bricks of the wall along Sydenham Hill. I managed to find on some local forums somewhere there's really blurry pictures of that. So you can see with the wall on Sydenham Hill and the gatepost that existed, only one exists now, and actually the wall that's almost broken on the right-hand side, that has completely disappeared now. That no longer exists. But you can still see remnants of the painted red and more mauve walls on the brickwork. Also, the Royal Mail was able to deliver letters to Solomon because he nailed the former house number of Beechgrove to an overhanging tree. And this is another picture I managed to find. And you can actually see he's written 111 Sydenham Hill. And it has been told by me from one of the residents of the Green that he used to receive letters all the time, and that he was seen as a fully blown resident of Sydenham Hill. But in my search for the last resident of Beechgrove, I also happened upon another hermit that lived in the woods 200 years prior to Solomon, a story that bore a striking resemblance to our modern day hermit. The story of Samuel Matthews can be found in Ye Parish of Camberwell by W.H. Blanche, published in 1875. And according to Blanche, after the death of his wife, Samuel Matthews decided to retreat and live in solitude. And although he was mildly eccentric, he was a quiet, inoffensive, and strictly honest man. He gained permission from the master of Dulwich College to dig a cave and erect over it a hut on that part of the manor, abutting in the rear of the college wood and in front of Sydenham Common. And also published in 1855, another account that was within the living memory of his death. He was an occasional gardener for some of the houses in Sydenham, with a habit of talking to himself. This article describes his cave as a mere hole hollowed out by himself in the earth, admitting him only on hands and knees, boasting no other furniture than a kettle hung on sticks, and a few rough bushes which guarded its entrance. The article adds, many who came to the wells went a few steps further to see the hermit's cave. Now, unfortunately, Matthews was murdered in Dulwich Wood on the 28th of December 1802. And at the time of his death, he was about 70 years old. The inquest was held in Dulwich Village, and when the verdict was willful murder by person or persons unknown. Although the Camberwell authorities offered a £25 reward for information which would help convict his killers, nobody was ever charged. However, Isaac Evans, well known about Sydenham and its neighbourhood as Wryneck Isaac, admitted on his deathbed in Lewisham Workhouse in 1809 that he had been one of those who had murdered Matthews. Now, the thing I find quite amazing was to find two stories that run in parallel. That 200 years separates two individuals that decided to exercise their squatters' rights and seek solace in the woods. But you'll be happy to know that our present-day hermit Solomon escaped Samuel's fate. Some of our neighbours remember Solomon fondly, and that he took pride in the appearance of his wood dwellings, but he was reluctant to leave. But eventually he was persuaded. Solomon was repeatedly approached by the City of London to move into May's house. This was a newly developed sheltered housing built for the elderly in the 70s. And then eventually, after lots and lots of asking, he finally accepted and moved in. So what about the archaeology of the present? What about the green in the present? Well, it's been a unique year. And I've been thinking about how we will record our COVID year. We don't all have to become a diarist, a 21st century peeps, because technology has been a major influence on how we record, co-create, and record stories of our lives. This year of COVID has not stopped us from engaging on social media channels. If anything, it's enabled us to link into digital communities as well as the physical ones that we live in. So I've taken inspiration from the Viral Shadows project on Twitter, the impact of COVID archaeologically in our spaces. So I thought I'd share some of the stories that we could potentially gather and archive for our community. And the thing that I've looked back on is that lockdown 1 has probably had the most influence on how we've interacted as a community and how the environment around us changed dramatically. So here we have a quarantine bingo card. I don't know if anybody's played lockdown bingo, but I'm pretty sure that you can recognize some of the things that you started doing or taking up. And for the green, we pretty much did quite a lot of these things. We all set up a WhatsApp community group account, which we constantly message each other on. I feel like as though we formed some kind of EAM-like attitude. So EAM being that the plague village in the Midlands, that we were quite protectionist about our beloved green, and also keeping an eye out, but very aware not to infect other people. making sure that we helped other people with shopping. We would leave things on people's doorsteps. That's how we interacted with other residents. We also we're very lucky to have 2 residents that are musicians. So we would regularly have outdoor open air concerts. We had the obligatory Zoom pub quiz as well. That still goes on every Thursday. Exercise classes on the green, and then when we weren't allowed to meet, these would continue via Zoom, and obviously the Friday locktail hour. But the interesting thing was what happened to the green and how non-residents interacted with the green. Now, the thing that kind of struck me was that there was a return to nature, that actually there was a commonization of the green. Nature took over and the green assumed its past role as a commonplace. Tall grasses started to grow. There was no longer the maintenance company that came to mow the lawn and look after the weeds. That wildflowers had returned, and so did people and the interaction with green spaces. We also found that suddenly we could hear nature. There were no planes. We weren't in the flight path of Gatwick anymore. That the birds are singing loudly. People were complaining on WhatsApp of the fact that the birds would wake them up in the morning, and that there was one pesky owl that they could hear all through the night. The air was also cleaner. Within 4 weeks, the air around the hill just improved dramatically. You could go for walks. It was like walking in the country. And then also we could see things all of a sudden. There was no pollution haze. We could see the North Downs, the Thames Estuary, and the QE2 Bridge. And also in lockdown 1, new legends were formed. We had regular daily sightings of people that we had never seen or been in contact with before, now utilising the green space. On WhatsApp, we had evening sightings of Marigold Tai Chi Man. This man used to come and visit us every evening, fully masked up and wearing pink marigold gloves doing Tai Chi on the green. We also had Birkenstock Mask Man, somebody who used to run in the same pair of jogging bottoms with a mask and Birkenstock shoes, and Meditation Lady, somebody who just simply used to sit in the middle of the green under our giant pine tree. But in general, people just came to visit, and they were awed and gobsmacked by this green space. And it was quite obvious to me that some people in London live to work and not work to live, which kind of breaks down as their triangulation of travel would only be to work, to the shops, and to their home, and no in between. But all of a sudden, they were forced to go out and look at their local spaces. Another thing that I've noticed is that seasonality is an influence on us. And so in the summer, we did spend quite a lot of time outside, normally separated and in our own family groups. But this is an example of my neighbour texting us on WhatsApp saying that she'd ordered an ice cream van so we could all go and have socially distanced ice cream, only in London, hey? And that throughout the seasons, the use of the green has changed. So during autumn, it's been used less and less. And obviously in winter, we've hardly seen anybody outside because it's so cold. And this is a picture of 2 weeks ago. It was the first time I think that we'd seen our neighbours in such a long time, because we managed to all make socially distanced snowmen and do a bit of sledging for our one and only snow day that we get in London every 3 years. But there's also the archaeology of impermanence, archaeology that might not last. So this is things like an NHS sign. Believe it or not, I took that photograph yesterday. One of our neighbours wrote "thank you" to NHS in chalk, and this is a year old and it still survives even after rain and storms and God knows what. And it's quite something really. And I want to know what kind of chalk she's used, but it's still there. It's very reminiscent of the ghost signs that you see of adverts on the sides of Victorian shops. And also people constructing things to see other people. So for example, this is one of our neighbours. she'd seen on Instagram a way that she could come and visit her grandchildren. She hadn't seen them for 8 weeks, so she constructed on those big plastic sheets with the glove arms in it, so she could actually hold her grandchildren. That was quite emotional. She hadn't actually seen them for such a long time, and it was, yeah, it definitely had an impact on the people who were sat on the green that afternoon. But also just silly things like snowmen, the joy of creation, and what we do to be with people. The snowmen might not be there after 2 days, but it's how we come together as a community and enjoy those times of impermanence, I suppose. So I was also inspired by a post on Twitter by a Canadian grade 8 teacher asking to share an artefact from the year and reflect on its importance. So I think the best answer I got was from Greta. She's the oldest and the longest resident of the Green. She was the first family to ever move into the Green. And she came up with this. I would be the bench outside my window on the Green. It represents the community, getting together, meeting when they could, and revitalising the spirit of the Green. It has been such a pleasure to see it being used by adults and children alike. I would say the same for the other benches. They seem to be a focus and enjoyed by many. There has been so many positive outcomes about coming together as a community, especially on mental health, but also the realisation that we are a community. I suddenly feel more connected to my space because for the most of my working life and living here, I've been away a lot of it. And that's the same for somebody else who lived on the Green, who suddenly decided that he doesn't want to work away anymore because he now feels connected to people. He said it was the first time that he ever felt connected to an actual space because he'd stopped and started chatting to people and enjoying them. And other people pursuing new careers. So the individual who started doing the exercise classes on the Green, she's now trained as a personal trainer and has carried on with this. So what about the future? How do we archive our year, and how could this feed into potential UK-wide projects? I'd really like to see a COVID archaeology study. We already do studies of archaeology on epidemics such as the Black Death and subsequent plague years, so why can't we do one for now? And what about the future of the Green? Well, May's house next to the Green, the place where Solomon stayed, is probably the most developed lot of land on the whole of Sydenham Hill. And it's currently going through its 4th incarnation. It's now under new development. The building was decanted in 2017 and it now stands empty and boarded up. And in the near future, there will be new families to tell stories to, and for them to tell their own stories. So should we as archaeologists tell more stories? And I would say yes, because regardless of where you are from and where you are going, you will always be connected to your place. I just wanted to leave you with a quote from the movie The Dig that was released on Netflix last Friday. And the quote is from May Brown, Basil Brown's wife, when Basil is chased away from his place on site. You always told me your work isn't about the past or the present, it's for the future, so that the next generations can know where they came from. The line that joins us to our forebears, isn't that what you always say? Why else would you lot be playing in the dirt?